Hello, everyone. I'm Pira Nada. Welcome to Rappler Talk. It's been 1 year since the World Health Organization declared a COVID 19 pandemic on March 11, 2020. So, that will be our topic for today. What has happened during this 1 year that has passed? Our lives were upturned and we've had to sacrifice many things. 12,500 people have died from the disease, and we have already vaccines in the Philippines. So, we're now looking ahead to what is coming up next and how we can get ourselves out of this rut that this disease has brought upon not just the Philippines but the world. And today we have a very special guest, Dean Ron Mendoza of the Ateneo School of Government, who is here to help us understand and really assess how the year has passed and what our government has done to deal with this pandemic. Welcome, Dean Ron, for join. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Pia. It's a pleasure to join you today.
Yeah, so our lives have been so different this past year. We remember in March, like I'm not sure what you were doing, but I remember that my husband and I were planning a beach trip, and we actually had to cut it short because of the lockdown declared by President Duterte on March 15, covering Metro Manila, and then a few days later, Luzon. So, ang dami na nangyari, we've all been stuck at home. We've been coping, dealing with the pressures of work. A lot of people lost their jobs. A lot of people are still hungry because they haven't been able to really get back on their feet. And students have had to learn from home. So many things have changed. Personally, siguro we'll start on this note muna. Dean Ron, how has your life changed this past year? How would you describe your pandemic year?
Where to start? It has been a busy year, a very tiring, in many ways exhausting year, but also in terms of engaging in governance discussions, very active and hopefully very fruitful year, informing our citizens and giving them a better understanding of how important leadership, governance, public sector management, and even the role of the private sector is in terms of responding to what is really quite a unique event. This global pandemic, the last one we've had of a comparable nature probably was many decades ago. But yes, I think it's been a busy year for me and for the Ateneo School of Government. Even though we're under lockdown, we did a lot of work and we engaged.
So siguro explain lang natin sa viewers natin, sir, why we've asked you especially to come here and to speak with us on this topic, because the Ateneo School of Government has been very active in even before the pandemic in assessing public response, even the economic side, dealing with NGOs and also decision makers in government, and trying to kind of form a synergy, some research on how best practices we can do to change governance for the better, especially participative governance. So that's why the pandemic has been a very huge governance issue. It's been the biggest government governance issue this year and in 2020 especially. And we've come a long way from March 11, 2020. Like that time, from zero testing, right? We're just going into the government response. We now test 25,000 people a day. Like yesterday, that's how many people we've tested. We now have 170 testing labs nationwide, and we have vaccines. So a lot has changed in our pandemic response. The government and Filipinos in general have kind of had a better hold of this disease, this pandemic. We kind of know more about the virus. We know more about how to protect ourselves. And so this has affected or at least lessened what deaths there would have been if we had not prepared, right? But also we have to remind ourselves that 12,500 people have died from this disease, and we've also experienced the worst post-war economic contraction. Our economy, our GDP shrunk by 9.5% last year. So those are huge consequences of the pandemic. But it's not just the pandemic that we can blame, right? It's also government response, because while we know that the disease is deadly, we've also known how to handle it, and it's really been up to our government to decide, when to pull the plug, when to order stay at home. And so a lot of these deaths, a lot of what we're seeing now is really a result of leaders deciding. So siguro, sir, we've seen countries all over the world have their own ways of handling the pandemic. What would you say were the defining characteristics of the Philippine government's response?
Well, first of all, I think you hit the nail on the head when you described the array of behavioral changes, public sector decisions, private sector decisions, and the actions of different stakeholders, church, civil society, academia, and individual behaviors. No, when you wear a mask, when you step out, when you stay in the house, how you actually protect your own family. These are all part and parcel of the collective action. Tinawag nga ng presidente natin yan na whole of nation response na kailangan para dito sa pandemya natin. So I think it is correct to describe the array of responses necessary in order for our country to fare uh, as good as we can under such a challenging environment. No one disputes that this is a unique and challenging environment for our country right now. And I think the um, I think most people actually would concede that they want to help government, they want to help the private sector, they want to cooperate in order to get us to, the light at the end of the tunnel, essentially, to get out of this pandemic. So the I think the characteristic or one of the characteristics of our country is a willingness to comply, uh, even as some parts of government were emphasizing a pasaway sort of narrative. I think most of the Filipinos, most of our communities, most of our stakeholders, and even most of our government has actually tried to work together in order to um, get us out of this pandemic and get us responding more effectively. So I think looking at the evidence and looking at what's out there, uh, part of what may have worked in our favor is the many small behavioral changes that have allowed us to somehow buy time, uh, to somehow strengthen our responses, and to somehow protect each other. In this country, we don't have a debate on masks. Um, you know, uh,
Thankfully.
it's yes, thankfully, it's a blessing. And in fact, if someone does not have a mask, it's most likely because of the cost of the mask. It's most likely because of poverty or lack of access to that particular protective equipment. And in response to that, the private sector responded, the government responded, local governments responded, the church responded to provide some of this equipment, right? Some of this gear, right? I think we also have an understanding of um, community. So many parts of the country, even as the pandemic raged, businesses started to protect their workers. Large companies, I was just in a conference the other day, tried to protect their SMEs, the ones working with them, their supply chains. So they knew and then they also started to protect their own workers as well, because they knew that there is strength in a solidarity response to this pandemic. That if you only protect yourself, you're actually not going to be successful, because the damage will be great. It will eventually reach a proportion that does a lot of harm if so many are actually left unprotected. So there is strength in a solidarity response, and I think that's what I would like to remember in the past year. That despite our governance challenges, and we have many, you cited correctly, some of the governance challenges, but I do think that for the most part, part of what is working in our favor as a country of over 110 million or so people, where we are actually close to the epicenter of the pandemic, we still manage to somehow, you know, um, control some of the harm. No, not all of it, but at least some of it.
Yeah, and even the fact that the government can get us to wear face shields, in other countries, right? Like people are allergic to face shields. They're thinking mask is bad enough. Don't make us wear face shields. But here in the Philippines, we really see, a pretty good level of compliance on the streets and the malls, lalo na. So yeah, you're right when you say that at least Filipinos can come on board when it comes to, diba, like risks to safety. Parang will really do something. Maybe it's part of the Asian culture. I don't know, but there's something there.
Yeah. Yeah. But I do think, though, that you are correct that there were governance challenges all around in the past year. Decisions that could have been made earlier, such as the control of travel into our country. If you recall, in the beginning, this time around this time last year, there was a raging debate on whether we would close our airports, close the
Yes.
travel, at least until we get further information on what's going on. And after we learned that other countries were doing the same, there was also initial vacillation about the severity of this potential crisis, a sort of a denial of the severity of the pandemic, which may have been sort of courage building device of some leaders, not to be scared of it, not to fear. On the other hand, this might also do damage if you don't get a correct sense of the severity of what's to come, and public policy and different actions by stakeholders are not appropriately adjusted in time in order to respond to what was to come.
Mm.
There were also a number of governance challenges on the ground when we wanted to lock down the economy and various parts of the Philippines. In fact, almost all of the Philippines has been under lockdown of varying degrees. And yet, other systems that needed to be in place were not in place yet. And so they needed to catch up, they needed to become stronger, such as our social protection system. If you lock down a family, where will they get their food? How will those important necessities get to them? And if some of those family members are actually workers, truck drivers, jeepney drivers, workers in companies, well, if they get locked down, then who delivers the food to the urban centers? Who gets the necessities to much of the nation? So I think part of the coordination challenge, um, it needed to be sharpened over time and quickly. But certainly, some of the decisions created a bit of chaos, a bit of um, lack of coordination, and this also added to some of the stress of uh, the early part of the crisis.
Mm.
I will end with this last point, which is the communication of the crisis has also not been ideal. And you
Mhm.
have different political leaders speaking up on this crisis. And of course, it is comforting for citizens to hear their political leaders express decisiveness and express leadership under a pandemic. On the other hand, we need medical experts and evidence based uh, policy making in order to guide our people and guide our stakeholders towards the right behaviors, not confusing signals from different leaders. And I'm not just talking about Malacanang, I'm also talking about different LGUs.
Mm.
Um, for instance, a governor in a province to the south of Manila was looking to a local cure
Mhm.
for COVID-19, which the science suggests is not going to work. So I think that's part of also the challenge, and it made the crisis unnecessarily much more painful and much less effectively coordinated because of this bad communications environment.
Dean, you mentioned the economy and how this pandemic affected, lalo na the informal workers in our economy who don't really have these social security safety nets that they could rely on during a crisis like this. And so people have said actually that the economy took a huge beating and the Philippine lockdown was unnecessarily harsh daw. And this is why the economy, went down the way it did. Do you think that that's true, that the lockdown didn't have to be that harsh?
Yes, I completely agree with that statement. We had a lockdown that was not very nuanced. There was a severe lockdown in almost all parts of the country, and even in parts where there was virtually no evidence of COVID-19. And this was made worse by really bad policy ideas like Balik Probinsya,
Mm-hmm.
where you actually had provinces that did not have COVID-19 and you opened the entryway for COVID-19 to get to them. So if you have this draconian lockdown mentality combined with a bad policy like Balik Probinsya, you're just basically spreading the disease and weakening the upside of a lockdown, which is to actually stop the spread of the disease. So it's sort of neither here nor there. So I think we could have had a more nuanced mobility restriction policy where if we had strong test, trace, and treat systems, we could quickly stifle the spread of COVID-19 where it's about to break out. That is the first condition that we needed. And we still don't have it because our numbers are still bouncing up and down around the thousands, right? Um, and number two is we need, so that's the first one, strong test, trace, and treat systems. Some of it we have, like we now have more testing, but I don't think we have strong tracking yet.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think we have a strong treatment system yet that immediately isolates risks. And this was borne out by the new COVID strain that started to embed itself in other parts of our country. And once again, there seemed to be a lack of urgency in terms of quickly, putting down the potential spread of these things. Um, that's the first condition that we need: test, trace, and treat systems that are strong. The second one, of course, is if you have that strong system, you can then afford a nuanced lockdown policy, a nuanced mobility restriction policy, which is what other countries have put in place.
Right, like Vietnam.
Exactly. You don't lock down the entire country. Your country will be on its knees in months because the economy will actually collapse, which is what happened to our economy, right? So, further to your point earlier, it was an unnecessary punishment on our economy to immediately lock down everything, when in fact, a more nuanced strategy that allowed for some tourism bubbles or manufacturing bubbles that are protected from COVID-19 to continue to operate and be protected from the disease. So that parts of our economy, we have 7,500 islands, we are actually well geared to be protected from disease spread because we have natural barriers that naturally stop and make difficult the
Mm.
spread of disease, right? That should have been our selling point to investors that
Mm.
we are the second most archipelagic country in the world, and we have a strong governance structure and a strong test, trace, and treat system that will allow us to quickly isolate this threat and contain it. So that is what I hope we will be able to manage with better leadership in the future. But right now, I must say that we missed out on that opportunity. We did not demonstrate that capability that effectively. And instead, we had numerous industries sort of simultaneously locking down. We have an education system that is still very, very closed and hampering millions of children from learning, even in places where there are no COVID, by the way. So it seems, yeah, it's a challenge of a more nuanced. I wrote an article on this and called it "We Need a Scalpel." We need experts to guide the policy rather than non-experts and politicians who would use an axe, basically chopping down everything. But also the good, also the capabilities that we should have been strengthening. Instead of that, we need a scalpel evidence-based policies, nuanced policies, strategies that actually build in our strengths as an economy, as a country, and demonstrating it during the pandemic so that investors are watching, our partners, development partners are watching, and they can see the capability of a country to actually be resilient to such a shock.
What does it mean, sir, that these kinds of policies were created at the onset? Yung very wide lockdowns, yung balik probinsya bagong pag-asa program. This calls to question how central health and science were to the response, and even how much the economic managers participated in the decisions on lockdowns. So what do you think it means that, nagkaganito yung policy na medyo exag siya? What does it say about the decision makers? And how do you think moving forward we can change the policy making process to be more nuanced, as you said?
Well, I think it already gives us a hint of that process when we lost the country's top economist in the past year. No, so he basically resigned, and this already gives you a hint of the lack of cohesion and I guess the lack of even internal solidarity of the leadership to make those evidence-based decisions, right? But having said that, I would also stress the need for consultative approach to the pandemic, even though you need decisiveness. But you do need to bring in, for instance, different stakeholders like the private sector, academia, the ones who can do immediate research and provide the evidence, and who would lend their capabilities and also their credibility, which is very, very important during a pandemic. People need to believe that they are in good hands. If they do not see this, they will second guess some of the decisions. They will basically concede that it's an environment of uncertainty. I'll give you an example. Presently, we are in the process of opening up the economy. And yet, we closed the economy about a year ago with far less cases of COVID 19. We are now bouncing around the 2,000 mark, something like this, or even higher. And we are about to open the economy. So that there is an inconsistency, even at that very basic level. Try to communicate that sa isa nating kapwa Pilipino dyan sa kanto. Explain mo, bakit nung ilang daan lang yung COVID, sinara natin yung ekonomiya last year, pero ngayon ilang libo yung cases, bubuksan natin yung ekonomiya, pakipaliwanag nga dun sa kapwa natin Pilipino yan. The challenge is it should have been evidence-based. It should have been guided by indicators of success and effectiveness so that you are convincing people, yes, this track we will continue. And if we continue to demonstrate this effectiveness, we will keep on opening the economy, right? Which is what other countries have done. New Zealand, Singapore, even hard hit places which initially tried to struggle with the disease. But right now, even if you open the economy, there will be doubt in people's minds. Will you, I mean, you mentioned you wanted to go on a vacation this time last year. Will you book a vacation in June if researchers in academia are predicting a potential explosion in cases by around end of the month or next month? That will trigger a potential lockdown. And a potential lockdown will trigger a potential waste of your money reserving, that vacation that you want. So amplify that to economic decisions at the bigger level where investors, consumers, many stakeholders are deciding, is this a real opening up of the economy where now the consumer confidence and the investor confidence can come back in full force? No, that cannot be legislated and that cannot be decided by government. It can only be decided partly by evidence and the strength of your communication that you are on the right track. You are convincing people, investors, stakeholders to trust that we are on the path to recovery. So my question is, do you think we are on the path to recovery? And that's our challenge right now.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned nga decision makers and that they need to consult, but we also know that these decisions or decisions to appoint certain people to lead the pandemic response also affected the confidence of people. At the onset, may mga criticisms na bakit mga retired generals yung ginawang leaders ng task force. Do you think this criticism, given that it's been a year, we've seen them implement, we've seen them on the ground, we've seen them, out and about doing their tasks. Do you think this criticism held true, or do you think that in the end, okay naman yung handling ng pandemic by these retired generals? I'm talking about vaccine czar Carlito Galvez Jr., Defense Secretary Delfin Lorenzana, and DILG Secretary Anyo.
Well, there are two parts of that question. First is, uh, do I think we could have handled the pandemic better? The quick answer to that is yes. With the right experts, with evidence-based policy making, with the decisive strengthening of the test, trace, and treat systems, which some LGUs managed to do, by the way. So they have it in place right now. Not in all LGUs, but in some, it's certainly in place. So yes, my answer is yes. We could have done a lot better, and we could have saved lives. Actually, I deeply believe this, that those early days and months when many people got infected, including health workers, doctors who lacked PPEs, and
Mhm.
this is how they got infected, and some of them died. Um, I think this is a an unforgivable waste of our wealth as a country, which is our people. We could have saved them. We sent them to a battle where they were unprepared,
Mhm.
and we were unable to provide them with what they needed immediately. So yes, believe we could have improved. The second part of your question is, could we have improved had we uh, another set of leaders managing the pandemic response, not necessarily military leaders, and nothing against military leaders. I think some of them actually managed very, very well. I talked to our private sector colleagues
Mhm.
who have a lot of respect for some of these leaders. But I do think you are missing something from this kind of a dominant leadership strategy, because it's not just one military leader, it's many military leaders. And then an overemphasis on lockdown. This is really two of the characteristics of the early responses last year. This changed, by the way, and this adapted,
Mhm.
thanks also to the openness of these same leaders that
Mhm.
we're
Mhm.
talking about. So I cannot fully critique them, because in the end, they also adapted and adjusted,
Mhm.
and they are in fact trying to work now closely with the private sector. So in defense of them, there appears to be some lessons learned. No, but my thing is, it's a pandemic. So what you really want is a Tony Fauci type person, um, restoring our trust, and basically the doctor you go to that you super trust for your mom, your dad, your wife, your kids. This is the person that you want telling you that we are in good shape. Do
Mhm.
not worry, we have taken the right steps. That's the voice that we needed, and we did not have that, unfortunately. Instead, we had a cacophony of different voices, including politicians, weighing in
Mhm.
on something that they are not experts in, and creating even more uncertainty because of their opinionating, which was not even evidence based. So, no matter what your doctors are saying, if that's the environment of communications that you see out there, then it's not surprising that investors are confused,
Mhm.
that our people are confused, and there is uh, potentially growing disappointment on the response.
Let's go to the Department of Health, because even if the generals led the implementing arm of the government with the pandemic plan, it was still the Department of Health who helmed the IATF, which was the one who created policies, diba, defined the quarantine classifications. How do you think Secretary Duque has fared during the year that has passed? And not just him, but also the entire department.
Oh, I think even by their own admission, which is kudos to them that they have practiced this degree of transparency, that they could still do a lot better. I would give our Department of Health, at least on that front of transparency, a strong grade,
Mm.
to the extent that all of the data that they were gathering, such as it was, and of course there were so many mistakes with the data, which were later corrected because of that same transparency,
Mm.
right? And that's how we help each other out, no, not to protect the information and hide it from the public or hide it from media, but to put it out there and get different stakeholders to understand it, to help you sort through it, to analyze it if it were academia, so that we can do better, right? And I think Department of Health, like many of our institutions that struggled with the pandemic, needed to quickly upgrade and catch up with the capabilities needed to respond on the different fronts. No, it's not just a medical response; it's a communications response. It's also a governance response, working with LGUs. Uh, it's also a procurement response, in terms of vaccines, in terms of PPEs, and it's also a public-private partnership response. As
Mm.
we quickly figured out, the private sector moves a lot quicker than the public sector, also because of the constraints we put on the public sector in terms of the procurement law, in terms of all these things. We suddenly needed a few laws in order to move forward on some public sector procurement and decisions, right? So I think many of these things, the Department of Health had to overcome, and my hats off to the bureaucracy, the non-political bureaucracy of the Department of Health, the career
Mm.
officials of the Department of Health that have really been on the front lines. I know them personally, many of them, because they teach in my school. They are actually students in my school trying to make themselves better public servants and to train the Department of Health staff in order to have more effectiveness in their mandate. So while I would say that yes, it could have been improved uh, much more, particularly in terms of leadership, I do think that the career
Mm.
public servants really held on and sort of kept things together. And it's unfortunate that you did not have a matching of that institutional strength combined with the right type of leadership for the pandemic response.
Hmm. So you mentioned leadership, and so I want to segue now into the man leading everything, supposedly, President Rodrigo Duterte. How would you say did he evolve? Did you see him change his crisis messaging, his leadership style during the year that passed dealing with the pandemic? How would you say he evolved, if so, and maybe he didn't? What do you think?
Yeah, I actually wrote a paper on leadership under pandemic, and basically to give credit to the president and some of our political leaders. They have been effective in some fronts, and certainly I think we must concede that during a pandemic and during a crisis, many of our citizens, particularly the president's supporters, would like to see the president step up and give us a very reassuring message that we are responding very, very effectively and decisively to the pandemic. I'm not sure the president delivered this effectively in times. He undercut his own message, over time. Initially, if you recall, earlier last year, he was basically providing the message that this is not really a big crisis. We can get over it. We even had some health advisors saying that they kicked this already. They beat this, because I can still see the tweets now circulating. or Facebook posts, as it may be. But unfortunately, that's not how it panned out, right? And I guess part of the challenge of leading under pandemic is that you need to assure citizens and rally the different stakeholders into action. One growth which I see in the administration, I hope it is emanating from President Duterte. But I did see this from the administration, is that they have really appreciated the role of the private sector.
Mm-hmm.
And remember, we are coming from a very populist rhetoric against the private sector, against the oligarchs, against big business in 2019 and maybe even going into 2020. But in the end, if you look at a challenge like a pandemic, it is actually the private sector that has responded very, very quickly, very, very decisively in partnership with the public sector in many ways, co-leading in this response. And I think that saved us from a lot more pain. Had the private sector not stepped in such a big way, um, we probably would have run out of ayuda. We would run out of resources to help the poor. Instead, we had a bigger array of stakeholders helping out communities, making sure that they had the means to comply with the lockdown, to comply with the measures that we needed to contain the disease. Uh, Also responded in terms of the equipment, the PPEs that we
Mm-hmm.
needed. And by the way, the testing capabilities, it is literally, as I understand it from the description of the private sector, literally from one testing facility in early 2020 to now several hundred testing facilities spread across the country,
Mm-hmm.
with a major share of these testing facilities run by the private sector, not the government, by the private sector. So I think part of the learning, part of the adjustment of the administration, and hopefully also of the president, is this stronger understanding that we cannot, public sector cannot do everything.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, if it tried to do everything, it would definitely fail. So the partnership with the private sector was critical, and we can see that more strongly today.
Mm-hmm.
So in sort of in recognition of that adjustment, at least we can see that in the administration now.
I recall one public address of the president where he really listed down, or at least his spokesman listed down, all of the businessmen who helped with the response. But at the same time, I also recall that he had speeches which were edited out by Malacanang where he threatened naman the same businessmen he thanked because of his, his war against the oligarchy, quote unquote. So I don't know. I guess it's pretty inconsistent. I mean, Duterte is consistently inconsistent naman, so I guess that's not surprising. But yeah, I agree with you that one thing. I expect this pandemic to should have humbled the president because it's not just private sector who stepped up, but even European diplomats, the same diplomats he threatened 2 years
Oh yeah,
ago, 'di ba, na we will bar all grants from the EU. But it was the EU who actually got the AstraZeneca vaccines here. So if that ban was still in place today, the AstraZeneca vaccines wouldn't be able to go to the Philippines. So
yes, yeah,
yeah, so it's just a funny kind
yes,
of turnaround of events. But
yes.
also going there, I mean, we've also seen recently sa mga public address ni President na when he's speaking about the pandemic, always there is a part in his public address where he hits critics. Recently, it's been Vice President Leni Robredo. A few public addresses ago, it was Carlos Zarate, the congressman representing mga progressive blocs in Congress. So, what do you think of this? Na alongside the pandemic, we have a very divisive policies, not just threats from the president's mouth, but also the signing of the anti-terror law, the shutdown of ABCBN, parang mga policies that a bit add to this feeling of claustrophobia in the Philippines now. What do you think this says about the pandemic response?
Well, what can I say? I mean, it's not needed. Instead of creating jobs, you destroyed jobs with the decision on ABS-CBN. And in fact, I think it's been proven that with the typhoons that eventually came in 2020 and some of the disasters and even the pandemic itself, the capability to communicate to our people, some of that was lost, particularly in the margins, in the far-flung areas where it was actually ABS-CBN that was able to reach out to them. And I think in terms of this divisive rhetoric and divisive language, I well, that part, I don't think there was much change. I think it is part of the style of leadership that we have seen in the past 5 years. And unfortunately, under a pandemic situation, that's the kind of thing that doesn't help, that even worsens things. It even creates more uncertainty. And yes, I hope somehow there is some learning, if not with the political leaders, at least with the citizens, that we understand that differences aside, under a pandemic, we need to act together in order to protect each other and our communities for a stronger response. And you may have political differences with other people, but we have to see the good and the effective in what different groups are doing and to strengthen that and to be mature enough to understand that critique is actually meant to improve things, not
Mm-hmm.
just to politicize something or to unnecessarily curtail any something, no, an activity. It is actually a means for our democracy to exercise checks and balances so we don't make bigger mistakes. And unfortunately, that's the I guess from a political communications point of view, you want to give a sense of solidarity and you want to give a sense of compliance and unity. On the other hand, what you don't want is big mistakes being tolerated in the guise of solidarity and unity, and that you will not critique something that is obviously not working just because we all want to be giving a solid image and perception of unity and solidarity under the pandemic. That's not right. So I think there is a space that government should provide, that the private sector should also engage in, stakeholders must engage in, media must engage in, so that we can do that. No, and
Mm-hmm.
that's why if you don't have that reaching out, you don't have that consultative process and those structures, you don't have that partnership model, um, then you're going to have it happen in media, in the public,
Mm-hmm.
in other areas where you need to actually cite evidence and you need to cite the truth. No, so I think this is the challenge that many of us actually faced. On a personal level, I'm quite exhausted trying to engage in this process too. But who wants to critique their government under a pandemic
Mm-hmm.
situation? Re- Basically showing everyone else in the world how weak some of our
Mm-hmm.
responses are. If there were an open space, a collaborative space,
Mm-hmm.
a reaching out, a partnership to actually guide the policies in favor of evidence and to guide the policies in favor of what really works, then you wouldn't need such a critique. Or even if you did have such a critique, then it should be interpreted as constructive criticism, something that makes us stronger.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, that has not been the theme of much of this administration.
My last few questions have to do with looking forward. So inject a bit of hope in our our sad discussion. This year 2021 is very close to 2022, which we know is the national elections. We will be electing a new president, a new set of senators, etc. How do you think this pandemic and the recovery from this pandemic will affect voters, will affect their decision making?
I don't know that we have evidence to claim, however, which way it will affect it. But I have a hope that um, voters and our fellow citizens will understand, sana maintindihan nila na importante ang pamahalaan, importante ang mga pinuno sa pag-manage natin ng pandemya.
Mm.
Na hindi to kasi minsan may pag-iisip na pandemya yan kaya talagang mahirap yan. Kaya talagang matutupi yung ekonomiya natin. Kaya talagang mawawalan tayo ng trabaho. Masakit talaga yan kasi talagang hindi maiwasan. No? Hindi yan kasalanan ng mga pinuno. Uh, sa isang banda tama yan, pero sa isa pang banda, kung mahusay ang pamumuno natin, dapat hindi kasing sakit yung epekto ng pandemya. Hindi kasing bagsak yung ekonomiya natin. Hindi kasing tagal yung hinihintay nating vaccines ngayon para makabalik na tayo sa buhay natin. So sana maintindihan ng taong bayan yan na hindi, yes, meron tayong mga challenges na ano yan kumbaga act of God yung pandemic, right?
Mm.
Pero kung meron tayong mahusay na pamumuno, mahusay na administration, at pumili tayo ng tama, yung nakikinig sa ebidensya, yung nagkukonsulta sa iba-ibang stakeholder, yung nakikipag-partner sa private sector para magtulungan tayo, yung rhetoric ay hindi divisive, pinag-iisa tayo rather than pagwatak-watakin tayo. Sana yan ang matandaan ng mga botante sa 2022.
Mm. And syempre yung economy, malaking bagay siya in terms of people deciding how leadership is affecting their lives. Kasi bituka yan di ba? Yung it's not
Yes.
really mga highfalutin issues that get them to think about voting, but it's yung presyo ng bilihin, yung mga yung mga bata nila kung nakakapunta sa school, mga ganun. So many issues that are close to the gut. So given this, 'di ba, economy being a big issue, what are your recommendations to government to boost the economy despite the continued rise in cases, despite the governance challenges? Moving forward, what can they do now to at least give it a lift?
Well, there are many things they could have done and they could still do. I think I've been an outspoken proponent of um, more direct means of stimulating the economy. Wag trickle down. There's such an
Mm,
emphasis on infrastructure na unti-unting magti-trickle down yan sa taong bayan, no? Parang dapat mas direkta yung ating pagtulong sa SMEs, sa mga
mm,
manggagawa, sa mga magsasaka, para doon manggaling yung productive response kasi sila talaga yung nahihirapan talaga ngayon So that's been one of the suggestions that we've been making. The second one is talagang kailangan nating ma-flatten yung curve, no?
mm,
Flattening the COVID-19 curve. Ano ibig sabihin nito? Kailangan talaga makontrola natin yung pag-spread ng COVID-19. Kasi kahit buksan mo pa yung ekonomiya, kung nakikita ng tao yung ebidensya at yung siyensya, maghuhunos dili pa rin siya. Hindi pa rin siya talaga babalik yung consumer confidence na hinahanap natin, right?
mm,
Yung investors, titingnan niya kung paano nyo ba nakontrola yung COVID-19, right? Hinintay nyo lang ba yung vaccine? Gaano kabilis nyo na-introduce yung vaccine? Pagka ba meron ng vaccine, nagpapabakuna nga ba yung mga tao o takot sila dahil meron
mm,
mga issue sa vaccination? And the government can actually tackle each and every one of these questions. Hanggang ngayon, meron pa ring issue sa Dengvaxia.
mm,
No? It is a vaccine that has been proven scientifically and supported by many other nations to work. And yet, it is still being politicized in this country to the detriment of an anti-dengue campaign, but also to the detriment of other anti-disease campaigns that we are pushing, including combating COVID-19. So I think that has been proven. Medical experts are saying that it's not actually helping us in any way. That such a controversy is still being pushed in a very political way by some actors in government. Kayang-kaya nilang itigil yan at magdesisyon na, teka, klarong-klaro na hindi ito nakakatulong So bakit ba hindi pa ayusin yung problemang yan, right? So I think there are several issues that the government can address if it were to look at the facts and look at the evidence and look at the non-partisan views of experts and medical experts at that, to try and get us together moving forward. And
Mm.
unfortunately, these are still are out there and are hampering us. So may headwind yung ating pag-recover. Hindi madali.
Mm.
Hindi V-shaped yung recovery natin dahil nga may mga bagay na medyo dapat namang gawin pero hindi pa nagagawa.
All right. So that ends our discussion on assessing the year that has passed, dealing with the pandemic. Thank you so much, Dean Ron, for speaking with us, giving us these insights. Hopefully, this year will be better. Hopefully, we'll see more unity, more effective response, and hopefully, diba, back to normal kahit paano, even just being able to see your loved ones again in person. So, yep, many hopes for this year. Thank you
Yes.
so much.
Thank you, Pia.
So again, thank you to our viewers for being with us today and listening to our discussion. Again, this is P. Renada, and you've been watching Rappler Talk.